thank you so much for, accepting the invitation to talk about your book today. I think your book is really timely, especially now that we are, seeing AI all around us, everyone using JAI, ChatGPT. And I think it's really important, to keep in mind that you really need to use our knowledge, our brain to make decisions and not just, put the ChatGPT in control of everything we do.
Thank you, Sergio, and it's a pleasure to connect with our Brazilian audience. Always, a country I love, and it's nice to be connected to it. So thank you for having me.
Oh, thank you. And Stefano, the first question, I have my book here, because I'm blurring, the background. So if I would like to show, I really need to put on my face. And I have read twice the book, and especially, to discuss with you. And 6 people, as Philippe mentioned in the beginning, you're gonna have a chance to win their own copy, and read the book completely. We're gonna go through, the entire book, discussing each one of the chapters. But I think the first question is, what have inspired you and Bart de Lange to write this book?
We met many years ago in the business of academia. We were basically, he was a PhD student. I was a new assistant professor at the time in Rotterdam in the Netherlands. And I come originally from statistics. I did my undergraduate and master's in statistics, and then I turned into behavioral science and psychology to study consumer decision-making. And Bart instead went to the other direction. He did his master and undergraduate in psychology, but he was really interested in data and analytics. So kind of like sort of crossed and met in the middle in trying to help companies make good decisions with data. There's been an enormous amount of attention over the last 2 decades or more on issues like big data and analytics and now AI, of course. And of course, we need to understand those topics from a technical standpoint. But I think really for many organizations, the low-hanging fruits, the things that really make the difference, is maybe not necessarily to add more complicated models or go even deeper into the technical side, but really trying to make a very good effort to connect decisions and data. That's where often things go wrong, where companies have data, have invested in data, have very competent analysts, but oftentimes all of that work is not functional, is not necessarily well connected to the important business decisions that managers take every day. So it's almost like you have a separation between data and decisions, and as the data gets more complicated, that the distinction gets even bigger. And over time, we are so far away now that it's not even often very useful. It's just confusion. So, and it might even be worse than that, actually. So we just recognize that issue in our teaching. And we were teaching basically decision-making analytics, and we found over the years that there were a few principles that seemed useful and a few cases and stories that helped to bring those principles into sharp relief so that people understand what this might mean and how they're important. And then at some point, we just decided to write it up and say, maybe this is useful to people everywhere to try to think. It's a very short book. It's not meant to be a book that you spend, days and days and days trying to get into all the little details of analytics or data. This is more about helping people achieve a perspective, a point of view, and hopefully that will be then a motivation and an inspiration to think a little differently about analytics. And the point that we make is that we get it wrong when we say that decision should be data driven. You really should flip the reference and say data are really a means to an end. They are there to help you. So it shouldn't be the decisions that are data driven. Instead, it should be the data that are decision driven, essentially. A simple change of perspective can make a big difference.
Yeah, and yes, it's a short book, but you know, you have many different examples and many different cases from many different industries and many different subjects. And also you have a lot of reference, you know, for academic articles. So if anyone would like to go deeper, they can go to the references and, you know, learn more. But I think
And you know, our
you did a
objective,
good.
our objective was, we don't want a book with any fat, no fat-free book. It's very, very to the point, clear examples.
Yeah, and actually, when we start the book, you know, right in the beginning, you talk about the framework for driven analytics, and basically you have four main components. Uh, which are they? You know, can you explain them briefly? Because I think you're gonna go deeper in any of them, you know, during the webinar.
So the principle is quite simple. Like I said, you switch in perspective instead of starting from the data and figuring out how they help you make decisions. You start instead from the decisions you need to make and work yourself towards the data. Basically, that's the general idea. And so if you think of it that way, you start with decision. That's the first pillar of our framework. And by that, really, what we mean is understanding your goals, understanding the objectives that are your priority, and then understanding what are the different ways by which these objectives could be met. So imagine that I decide that my destination is there, and I want to go from point A to point B, increase my sales, improve customer retention, whatever, you know, improve your margins, your penetration, whatever business objective, commercial business objective you may have, doesn't matter, anything. You want to go from A to B. You want to change the world so that the world looks more like you wish it to be. And then you can actually realize that you have many ways by which you can go from A to B. And the goal of the manager is to understand what are the most impactful, more feasible of those pathways to go from A to B. What could I do to do this? Do I need to run a campaign? Do I need to improve some features in the product? Do I need to, you know, speed up my processes? Do I need to cut my cost? Do I need to, you know, raise awareness for my products? What is it that you could be doing to do that? And then you narrow it down and say, okay, these are three things that we could do. And now I need to decide which course of action is the best. And now you don't know, because, you know, there are arguments for all of these. These are selected because they are good options, or at least they seem like good options. So now, after the first step, now that you have identified possible courses of action to achieve your objective, the next step is what we call the question step, which is, how do I know a good decision? If I see it, well, what is a good decision? So meaning, by which criterion, by which benchmark should I be judging the quality of a decision? In other words, I'm now asking a question that helps me rank one option versus the other. Basically, if I know the data about this question, if I know the answer to this question, I would know which decision is the right one. Now, after the question stage, you go to the data. So now you can talk to the analyst and say, okay, this is the menu of options. These are the criteria by which we're going to rank this option. Now go find me the data that help me rank those options. In other words, the data in the analytics process only come in quite late. There is a lot of thinking to be done before you see or collect the data. And that's something that we are often in organization not used to doing. We start from the data. Oh, with data mine, we have so much data. We have a lake of data. Actually, we have an ocean of data. You know, there's so much data. And then you run analysis and you try to find something useful. And then you say, okay, there must be value in all of this data. But that's often not working, because then your analyses are not married to the decisions you need to make. And so if you work this way, like I was saying, if you bring in the data only after you clarified potential courses of action and the criteria by which you would know which one is a better one, then now you're in a position where your analytics is laser focused on the things that matter to you. And so hopefully the data will give you an answer. And sometimes data are there's more uncertainty, less uncertainty. They're easier to get, harder to get. You have this trade-off between, useful and, perfect. Sometimes you can get the perfect data only in 2 years, no use in that. So you have to cut some corners to get the answer. Now, whatever, all the considerations that go into managing an analytics program. And at this point, you come to the last step. The last step we call the answer. And if all things have been done well, this step is easy, because now you have the menu of options. You know by which criteria you like one option versus the other. You have the data that gives you a criteria, and all you need to do is to pick the winner.
Yeah, it seems so straightforward, but in general, I think you act in a different way. You have, a data lake, a lot of data, and you start, digging those data and trying to find, some correlations and some causal relations within those data. Most of the time, what you always are listening people is we are data-driven decision. We have data-driven decision making, a data-driven decision making process. So here you're talking about, start thinking without the data. So first, see what are the goals you have, and then the questions you should use to analyze the course of actions you have, and only then you're going to work with the data to find the answers. So I think one of the points, and there is a session in the first chapter of the book, you mentioned that you have things upside down. So you are not talking about, data-driven decisions, but decision-make analytics. I think that's a very different way of working with data.
And I completely recognize the desire of behind this notion, the trend towards data-driven decision making, and I appreciate that. In a way, we all agree that with data we can make better decisions. The question is, how do we go about doing that in a complex world where there is a lot of ambiguity, there is little time, scarce resources, and lots of data potentially, or maybe no data sometimes. So the world is not the way that you wish it to be. So you have to make decisions in this complex environment. And I think our approach has the advantage of making sure that you invest in the right analytics and that you answer the question you should be answering. And sometimes you will not be able to find the data you really need. And that's okay. I mean, that's, this is true for everybody. We never have the data we wanted. No, mostly. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't try, but also doesn't mean that you cannot still get useful insights from some data. Maybe they're not perfect, but it's better than nothing. And so I think we can make better decisions with data. Our approach of decision-driven analytics is not to imply that we shouldn't focus on data. The data is super important. It's just that the data are a means to an end. They are not an end in itself. We don't make money out of data generally. We use data to make money, right? So we need to make better decisions so we can push our business forward.
Yeah, and you also mentioned, that sometimes the data-driven becomes the preference-driven decision. And could you explain more about that? You have a case in the book.
Yeah,
a
that's
meeting.
that's a very important distinction. It's a bit of a sore spot kind of discussion for a lot of organizations, I think, because what you see is that in many situations, data are used as an excuse to justify basically decisions that have already been taken. So imagine you have a boss, the boss has a vision that we should be doing something based on whatever, gut feeling, whatever. And then the boss says, but if I just say it like that, do whatever I say, people are not going to be happy about it because we need to be data-driven. So now what I'm going to do, I'm going to cherry pick the data that support the case that I want to make. And so I'm basically going to force feed the data into the question such that I get the answer that I want. And now you have something that we call preference-driven analytics, where your analytics are really an instrument of politics almost. And so you have already made a decision. You need to give it some kind of aura of objectivity. It has to look like it's rooted in data and objective arguments. So you're going to pick all the data that you like to make that case, and then you present those data as if you had planned that all along, or if there had been no other data you could have picked. And that might be persuasive. People might say, oh, wow, very impressive. Look at all these numbers. But that's a very bad way of making decisions. So in fact, what we argue is that you should really try to decouple your judgment from your preferences from this analytics process, meaning the data should speak, not your desires. And so sometimes you'll run into a situation where the winning option is an option you did not like for whatever reason. And you need to be ready to accept it. It takes a lot of intellectual humility to say, I actually don't know. And so let's have the data speak.
Yeah, sometimes it's just that. Oh, just show me the data that it just confirms I'm right. Or
I mean,
also
we've all been in a meeting like that. You probably have
yeah,
experience of
and
being in
I've
this
been in
meeting.
meetings, that the customer already has a solution, and I need to use this solution. But no, first you need to define the problem you have. So you're gonna choose the best solution. No, you're not understanding. I already bought this, and you really need to use this. And there is also
Yeah, so
another.
for consultancy, sometimes you have a company,
Yeah,
they want to do this, but they know
yeah,
that if they just say we're going to do this, people are not going to be happy. So what we're going to do now, we're going to hire a consultant who then we say, go find me the data that shows that what I want to do is the right thing. And then now you say, you see, it's not me saying this, it's the consultant.
yeah. And sometimes if it doesn't work, you can torture the data until it confesses
Until it
what you
works,
want. For
yeah.
example, in the book, you mentioned about the vaccines for COVID. Many companies trying to prove that they are more efficient than the competitors and things like that.
Yeah, we see that the one problem with this preference-driven analytics is not only that you're cherry-picking the data, but also the analysis that you do. Oftentimes you basically, and sometimes it doesn't have to be like, it could be even quite a non-conscious thing. You want this to be true, and so you look at the data in a way that confirms whatever expectations you had. And so it's a bit difficult to really separate your desires from the objective realities. And so for that, actually, it helps to me. It helps if the analyst, the person who runs the analysis doesn't have, sort of like a skin in the game, meaning doesn't have, for this person, whatever it is, and they just do the analysis as we have agreed, as per the analysis plan that was agreed at the beginning of the exercise. And that makes it easier, whereas the person who has a lot at stake in the process and has a favored solution, I really want that to be right, then oftentimes that ended up kind of polluting the data analytics.
Yeah. And so our start point in general is decisions. How should how should I create a list of relevant decisions for my business? The different course of actions I have, and how can I evaluate them? And one thing you mentioned in the book is you really should to choose the actions we have control. So what should we consider when we are elaborating a list of course of actions available?
So this is a big topic, and we could actually, you could write a whole book just about how do you decide on the courses of action. And I think in our book, we provide some ideas, but I think there's so much more that could be said. If you think about an organization, a hierarchical organization, decisions are made at every layer in the organization. And every decision maker in each of the layers have a scope of responsibility. These are the things that are my domain, my responsibility. This is what I'm accountable for. And then there is other things that are for other people, either colleagues on the same vertical, let's say, layer of the hierarchy, just doing another thing, or people above who make decisions for a bigger pool. And so sometimes you see managers, I've been in meetings of that kind, where people are considering courses of action, which are really, they have no power to influence. So imagine that I am a manager who is, tasked with improving customer retention. And there are many different ways in which you could improve customer retention. And maybe one of the best ones will be improve product quality. Well, I mean, I'm not a product manager, so I have very little power to do that. So that I shouldn't worry about that too much. Now, if I think that the biggest issue for customer retention is that we're selling bad products, then what I should be doing is to lobby upstairs with my boss and say, you guys need to take a look at that. But it's for them to do it. You don't have that power. So you should think about, okay, what is my power then? What are the things that I can move? Which are the levers that I can pull? And then focus on those. Like I said, if there are other things that you think are important, but they are not part of your tools, then of the levers you can pull, then go talk to people inside the organization, try to lobby, try to highlight and add urgency to that issue. But that cannot be part of your menu because you have no influence. Even if it turns out that's the best way to do it, it's not going to happen. So then you're just wasting your time.
Yeah, so you really need to know what course of actions are your control. Also, how is the impact of that course of action? What kind of outcomes you're gonna bring to the business? So I think there are many different ways you can and talk also about having a broader view to select all the course of actions, because sometimes people, they have so narrow the alternatives that they are working with, and they don't consider other diverse course of actions. Is that right?
Yeah, that's, I think, is a big problem because you tend to be in a role for a period of time. And so what we are making decisions about today, we had made decisions about yesterday. And so there is a baggage. So we have a history of doing things a certain way. Also, the industry has certain ways of doing certain things. So there are conventions, there are habits, and so oftentimes those things can narrow our horizon and lead us to think that there is only one way to do something. And sometimes there might be other ways to do it, which we haven't looked at because we basically were too consumed by, our expertise, our habits, and what everybody else around us think. So in the book, what we argue that is very crucial in the first step, that you think widely, broadly, that you take a very different perspective. This is one of the biggest benefits of diversity in organizations, in my opinion, is to provide you with different perspective on things so that you can maybe find a new way to go from A to B that you haven't thought about. Maybe it's a better way, and but then you cannot think about a million different options because that's not tractable. You cannot manage that. It's too complicated. So then you need to bring it down to a small set of promising options. So we think of it as a funnel. You start very broad, think very freely, and think about what could we do to achieve this, and think outside the box and try to be creative about it. And then you make an inventory of all these options, and then you quickly realize that this is never going to work. This is taking too much time. This one, it seems unlikely to work. This one, we have data already in the past showing that is not a good idea. Okay, all of that, we narrow it down. Then we end up with a limited set. It might be just one, do, not do. It doesn't have to be a large set. But now we have basically a set of options we believe we need data for. And so at that point, we're going to bring in the analytics and think about what kind of data could help us understand which of these options is better. Sometimes you have the data, just a matter of pulling it from your systems. Sometimes you don't have the data and you need data collection, whether that is a survey of customers or maybe scraping some data on the web, run an experiment, whatever. Your analyst should be there to support the decision process. But, basically you want decision options that are diverse in their scope. You have decision options that are impactful, that you do something really going to make a difference. This is something we notice as a problem in a lot of decisions in organizations. We are a bit too conservative sometimes. We do things that we know are kind of going to work, but they're not going to be ever great changes, just moving the needle a tiny bit. And so sometimes it will be better to put more energy in things that will give you a biggest bang for the buck, but maybe entail a little bit more risk. It could be certainly a bit more work, and maybe a different perspective. Always hard to do. But I think this idea, you go broad, then you bring in narrow by your judgment. Managerial judgment is crucial. Technology, analytics are not taking away the importance of expertise. In fact, I would say that in a more complex world, expertise is even more important because only an expert is able to have the nuanced judgment to be able to identify right courses of action in a very complex situation. But that expertise should be thinking freely, shouldn't be, narrowed and constrained by habits and expectations. You want to be open-minded, and then let the data help you and understand. And maybe, it turns out that the thing you did for 10 years in a row is exactly the right decision. But then you feel much better about that course of action now that you have the hard data showing you, right? Rather than keep doing it just because.
Yeah. Sometimes you really need more diversity, and consider another course of actions, because sometimes just keep doing always the same thing, and having this, broader perspective helps you to find other course of actions.
And the world is changing. So the fact that 10 years ago a particular decision was the right one doesn't mean it's always going to be the right one, right?
Yeah, sometimes, you just listen, well, we always did in this way, so you keep doing this. And why? And one thing also is, Stefano, we just have a list of possible course of actions. And then we start, with the questions to refine and define the action you're gonna take. And you mentioned a lot of the questions. How important is, having very clear questions, and how to avoid fuzzy questions? Because sometimes you have a very high level question expecting very precise answers. So how can we deal with, the questions you use to choose and to refine the course of actions we have?
Yeah, so our point of view in the book is that as much as you can, try to stay down to earth, meaning try to be very concrete in your thinking. Don't become, very big picture questions are almost impossible to answer with data. We make an example in the book where we had this workshop with the brand managers and analysts of a consumer goods manufacturer from Europe. And we were asking the brand managers to formulate questions that they would like the analyst to give an answer to. And half of the questions that were written on the flip charts, you couldn't have answered with data. And many of them, even if you did answer them with data, the brand manager wouldn't have been able to do anything about. Maybe because those decisions are really taken at the headquarter and not in the regional subsidiary. Or maybe because even if you don't like the answers, there is really, no way you're going to change the way this consumer is thinking or whatever. And so oftentimes the problem was really the questions being asked. And then, of course, you end up in a situation where the managers are not happy because the analysts are not giving them the answer they wish. The analysts are unhappy because they get these very vague, weird questions that they cannot possibly, work with. And so nobody's happy. And then in the end, it's a blame game. And so the managers say these analytics people are useless. The analytics people think those brand managers are idiots or whatever. And so it ends up being really unhelpful. And so ideally what you do is that you align the language, and so that we now speak at the same level and we can actually make progress. So if you are a brand manager, just to stick to the same example, and you want to talk to analysts, then think about what kind of questions would inform my decisions next week, and what kind of questions can I answer with data. And that is not going to be a question about, is the broader public, resonating with our brand mission? I mean, what? That's not a question, but that's the kind of question that came on the flip chart. But that's not the question they should be asking. They should be asking more like, what is the relative value of that product attribute for this customer segment in this market? Maybe that's something the analyst can pull through a regression model or maybe an experiment, like a conjoint or something like that. And then you can make progress. So this is something we say, that the people have the tendency to ask very vague questions and expect very precise answers, and they get it all wrong. What they should be doing instead is to ask very precise questions and accept vague answers. And by vague answers, we really mean acknowledging uncertainty. We hate uncertainty. We hate ambiguity. We want to know, give me what is the weather tomorrow? Give me a temperature number. I want to be certain about something that I cannot be certain about. There is uncertainty about who's going to win the next election, which product is going to be successful in the market, what advertising works for this customer group. You can only try to get an estimate of these things using data, but there's always going to be error. And so I think as a manager, you need to always make decisions under uncertainty. And unless you acknowledge the presence of uncertainty, you can make big mistakes. So basically what we say is that you want to go from a situation where we see it a lot now in companies, managers asking, vague questions, fuzzy questions, and expecting a precise answer, to a situation where the same managers now are trained and in a mindset where they ask very precise questions and they're comfortable with uncertainty.
Yeah, and sometimes it reminds me the Alice in Adventures in the Wonderland. When she comes to a fork in the road and she talks to a cat, the Cheshire cat, and asks him, "Well, what road should I take?" And the first question he asks her is, "Where would you like to go?" And she tells, "I don't know." And then he just answers, "Well, take any one of them because it doesn't matter which
And
one
it
you're
doesn't
gonna
matter where you're
take."
going.
If you don't know where you're going, any road, can be used.
Right, so that's a great story, actually. We don't have, yeah, I love that you bring this up because it really brings you back to what we were talking about before, where you only really need to start from, which path, where do you want to go? You need to have it clear in your mind. These are our objectives. And I think we can pursue this objective by doing one of few things. And so it helped me with data to understand how to prioritize among these.
Yeah, and still speaking about questions, we'll talk about two different types of questions, the factual questions and counterfactual questions. What are they, and which ones should we use, to choose our course of action?
In the book, we make the general point that if you don't do decision-driven analytics, but you do them more, what you see a lot of companies do when they do data-driven decision-making, oftentimes you end up answering the wrong question. That's a big problem because you think you're answering the question that you need to answer, but in fact, you're answering a different one, which might not be very related to the good answer. So in the book, we have a bunch of cases which illustrate this problem. This framework that you are highlighting, I think, is crucial to that. There's distinction between factual questions and counterfactual questions. Sometimes I want to know a fact about something that's going to happen in the future or something that is already happened, but I am not aware of it. So I want to estimate a quantity. For example, imagine that you are an operations manager and you want to run your factory smoothly. You need to have predictive maintenance. Basically, I need to have a model that helps me understand when a particular machine is going to need maintenance or repair or to be substituted. I mean, this is crucial for everything. Imagine you're an airline, clearly you don't want to wait for the planes to start falling off the sky. You want to make sure you know when you need to do certain things. To do that, you need predictive models. So these are basically models based on data that they will help you to make predictions about the quantity. So let's go back to the factory kind of example. Imagine that we have these kind of machines already for a number of years. So we have tracked over time, what happens to these machines, how many hours are being used, for how long, in which way, and then when did malfunctions happen, and what kind of malfunctions, and so forth. If I have all that data, and either I have it or the manufacturer have it, someone has information of that kind, then I can build a predictive model, maybe a simple regression model, or maybe something more complicated. But basically, a model that tells me, given these inputs, for example, the machines that I have now, how much they're using it, and when did I buy them, when did I repair them last, or whatever data you have, can you make a predictions about the time when failure becomes likely? So that when I have that information, I can make sure that I repair the machine before the failure happens. Okay, so that's we do that all the time. We need to manage everything by anticipating the future, and we can anticipate the future through predictive modeling. And so it is really important that we do that, and those factual questions are very important. For example, you want to make sure you maintain a healthy cash flow. For that one, you need to have predictions about markets and margins and profits and cost and all of that, and when they're taking place. So you're making sure that your ship sails smoothly. However, there is a different type of question, which is also very important. And that question is a type of question we call counterfactual question, which is a situation where you're not just trying to anticipate the future based on the input from today. You're trying to understand, in fact, what is going to happen when I change something in the world. I now design an intervention. Maybe it is an advertising campaign, or maybe it is some kind of promotional offer, or whatever thing I might be planning to do in order to boost my business objectives. Then my question now becomes, what is going to be the delta, the change that my intervention is going to create? And that's a very different kind of question, because in the factual question, you're in a steady state kind of thing, or at least you can predict how the states are changing, and you basically use the past to predict the future, or use information about these customers to make prediction about these other customers. If you know the similarity between the two groups, you can make good predictions. But now you're doing something different. Now you're planning to turn a switch of some sort. You're going to make a change, and then you want to know what's going to be the effect of that. And so imagine that I am planning to make an intervention to improve some business objective. I turn out there are maybe a couple of things I could do. I could run another campaign. I could give a price discount or whatever. How do I know which one is the best? Well, you want to anticipate what is going to be the impact of that intervention on the people that you're targeting with the intervention. The problem is that now the past might not be a good guide for the future, because the future is going to be different. You're going to do something. And so for that one, typically we need experimentation. We need to basically have a way of mimicking this idea that I change something in the world. So I have a randomized control trial, for example, where you would have a treatment condition and a control condition, where I have people randomly assigned to one treatment or the other. For example, half of them get a price discount, half don't, half get an advertising exposure, half don't. And then I'm gonna see what's gonna happen to the two groups, and hopefully now being able to estimate, at least make an estimate of that delta, of that change. Now, the problem is that in many situations, people are confusing the two types of questions, and they are treating counterfactual questions as if they were factual questions. So you see that, for example, in advertising. You see it in a lot of other contexts. We make a few
Churn, for example, you have example in
churn.
book.
Churn is example. In the book, we spend a lot of time talking about churn. And so in the context of churn, just using that example, you imagine that you want to make an intervention to decrease customer churn, increase retention. What a lot of people are doing is that they're building predictive analytics models that give you an estimate of which customers are most likely to leave, which customers are most likely to churn. And then the standard, let's say, wisdom is that what you're going to do is to send some kind of targeted intervention to the people who are at the highest risk of churn. This is a completely wrong way of thinking about it. What you should be doing instead is to think about it. Look, I have an intervention, and I want to know, I cannot give it to everybody, I need to choose who's going to get this. So what I want to do is to give it to the people for whom the intervention is going to have the biggest effect, right? I don't want to necessarily give it to the person who are most likely to risk of churning. I want to give it to the person that is going to benefit the most from the intervention, regardless of whether they are highly likely or lowly likely to churn. Everybody has a certain likelihood to churn, right? I can always bring that down. And so the question is, who do I send it to? And so that you cannot often answer with the historical data, because you haven't done that intervention before, and therefore you don't know. And so what you need to do is do a pilot, estimate the effect of that intervention on different customer groups, figure out the delta, learn about the impact of that intervention on different groups of people. And now that I know, I'm going to send it to the people for whom that delta is largest. They may be the people with the highest likelihood to churn. They may not. Maybe they're even the people with the lowest likelihood to churn. You don't know. But the fact that you were basically going to the predictive analytics and directly sending the intervention to the people with the highest likelihood to churn is exactly one example of this confusion between factual and counterfactual questions.
Yeah, and in the book, you have two different companies with the experimentation, who should they, intervent, and the results are completely different from one company to the other. The first one, those with, which are less likely, to churn, respond better. And in the other companies, completely the opposite. So we really need to make this kind of experimentations to select the best course of action.
Yeah, and you can easily see why, right? So maybe in one context, the people with the lowest likelihood to churn, maybe these are the people who had forgotten even that they were paying for this. So now you send them an offer and you remind them and say, wow, I'm paying for this. That's stupid. I shouldn't
I
do it.
should
And then they
cancel
stop.
that.
On the other option, it could be people who are, really already kind of like unhappy with the thing and were thinking already of leaving, and you contacting them is just, what tipped them over and changed. You don't know. And so it could be a lot of different things. So in a way, what we argue is the point we were making before there, is say you want to align your analytics and your decision making. If your decision making is about which intervention or who should I target with this intervention, that's a question you could ask and answer with data, then that question is different from the question of who is most likely to churn. And I should not think about that. I should think about my intervention question. And for that, I need a pilot. Now, that is not to mean that a predictive model about likelihood to churn is useless. You have lots of uses for that. It's just that you need to be always clear. This is a factual question, and this is a counterfactual question. So I, all the time, to people I talk to about how to make decisions with data, I say, whenever you face a situation, a problem, start by asking, is it a factual question or is it a counterfactual question? That often is very informative of the type of data that you need, the kind of study that you need to conduct, and the answers that you're going to get.
Yeah, I think it's really, really important. Is sometimes, you just do what is written in Wikipedia, the best practice, without, taking in consideration what would work better for our business. And you mentioned about the data also, and during in the process of this data-driven analytics, it's really important to know how the data is produced and how you can use it for decision-driven analytics. And also another thing related to data. In general, we always think that big is better. And do you always need big data, to use in our decisions?
Yeah, this is, I think, another very important point when it comes to analytics. We love big data. The bigger, the better, right? And I understand why. I mean, it's impressive, right? So you have a lot of information. The decisions seem to be based on, on better foundations when they're based on a lot of data. The problem is that when you think about statistics in general, you run into two different kinds of problems. One is a problem of noise, and one is a problem of bias. And for those of you who have done a bit of statistics and market research, you might also be familiar with the notion of reliability and validity. Okay, so noise is the fact that there's a lot of error, a lot of uncertainty, big variance in your data. And so you want to bring that down. Bias is instead you are not answering the right kind of question. Your indicator is biased, is not really accurate. And so you want to correct both problems. How do you correct them? Well, one way to correct them is to get better data. Now, if you collect more data, that helps, but it only helps by bringing down noise. Typically in statistics, when you add sample size, your estimates become, your bands become tighter. So now you have, your point estimate is more precise. However, just simply adding more data doesn't do necessarily anything about bias, because bias is about the data generating process, is where the data are coming from. And so the problem is that we tend to confuse noise and bias again. And so when we get a bigger data set, we tend to believe that the estimates are not only less noisy, but also less biased. And while the first is true, the second is not true. So we have examples in the book where, for example, we talk about an academic paper by some friends of mine who basically show managers, they bring managers into a simulation, like a game. They tell them, imagine they need to make a decision about an investment in advertising. They are running a restaurant chain, And one option they have is to make an advertisement on Yelp, this big American portal for restaurants. And so they say there are two studies that you can use to make the decision. There's a experiment, and there is a correlational analysis based on restaurants already advertising on Yelp. And what they find is that in the experimental study, advertising on Yelp does not have an effect, but in the correlational study, advertising on Yelp does have an effect. What do you want to do? Now, in a condition in which the correlational analysis on Yelp was not a very large study, people tend to believe the experiment and say, we're probably not going to spend money on advertising. But there was a second condition in the same experiment where the managers were randomly assigned to reading the same studies, but now the correlational study was much larger. It was huge, big data. And now people believe that study, And so all of a sudden they want to advertise. Although, the design is the same and that data could be biased. For example, there are many reasons why a restaurant that advertising on Yelp may have better ratings. Maybe they just have better resources. Maybe, they make more profit and therefore they can advertise or whatever. There could be a lot of reasons that might not necessarily be a causal effect of advertising on performance. And so that's one example where just adding sample size, the amount of data gets people to believe that data are more reliable. And they might be more reliable, but they're not more valid, and people confuse it too. So what we do in the book is to call for attention and say, you want good data. Big data might be actually big bad data. Big bad data is terrible. Big bad data is the worst, because now you make bad decisions with precision. You are precisely wrong. Like that's the worst.
Yeah, I agree with you. You really need the good data to make decisions, the appropriate data to the questions you would like to answer. And talking about the answers, in general, you have one section in chapter 5 where you talk about fussy questions and fuzz answers, because most of the time what you really are expecting about a decision-driven analytics are precise answers. So could you explain what does
so
it
we
mean?
talked about this before. We make this word play with the fussy and fuzzy. And basically we say you want questions that are very precise, but you want answers that acknowledge uncertainty. And I would say, actually, this will be an invitation to all the listeners here to say, whenever you sit in a meeting, make sure that whenever they present data to you, that they are presented with a measure of uncertainty around it. You should have an interval and say, okay, we predict that the sales next month are going to be 2 million. Okay, that's good, but I want to know the uncertainty. What is a 95% confidence interval about that number? Is it like 1.9 million versus 2.1 million? Or is it 1 million versus 3 million? Huge, right? So that is going to make a difference. If it's 95% chance that is within a narrow band, you can take that confidence, that point, very confident, make decisions based on that. If there's much more uncertainty, you want to also make sure you acknowledge that. You don't want to take big risks, for example, when things might come out very different.
Yeah, you really need to understand you have uncertainty and the world is complex. And you really need to deal with that. There is no way to have precise questions all the time because things are changing. You're talking most of the time in terms of problems related to customers, to people. And, people are always, unpredictable and complex. So there is no way to expect very, very precise questions in general. And one thing, so we are talking about using data and using analytics to make decisions, but it's always beneficial. What should you consider, to use analytics or not? In chapter 6, data for a purpose, you have, 3 questions you should ask to evaluate if analytics is good or not for the decision you're gonna make.
Yeah, so the process, the analytics process, the way that we sketch, it's quite consuming, meaning you basically have to put a lot of thinking and then perhaps you don't have the data, you have to go get the data. It's a difficult process. It requires a lot of hard work. And so we argue in the book that maybe, it doesn't make sense to do it for every single decision. You want to pick the decisions where it's really worth it. And so in a way, what we do in every chapter is that we end the chapter with a thinking trap and say, this is something, a bad way of thinking that people tend to fall into and creates problems. And one trap that we describe in that chapter you're referring to is the notion that more analytics is always better. They should always do analytics if you can. And what we argue is that, well, not really. I mean, there are many decisions that we can live with the uncertainty of maybe not making the right decision because they're not very important decisions. Or maybe sometimes there are decisions which are potentially important, but where we don't really have power to change things. So if we're going to do something anyway, there's no point wasting time getting analytics. And so in general, what we say that you want to basically, in your head, you want to compute the return on analytics almost. And so that's a combination of the importance of the decision, the likelihood that you're going to be able to rank these options, and also the cost of getting the data. And if the cost is too high, at some point you'll decide analytics is not worth it for me. Or maybe if the time is too long, you don't have the time, you can't do it. So there will be all kinds of situations where you might decide you're better off without analytics and maybe invest all your scarce analytics talent and time on those decisions that really make a difference and where it is feasible to have a good answer. So it's just in the final chapter, we wanted to make sure that people didn't leave the book thinking, oh, this is paralyzing, overwhelming. There is no way that I can do this for everything. Of course, you can't. And what we argue in the book is that you need to basically, this is a key element of leadership and managerial expertise, is to make a decision about what are the things where you really should invest in analytics and do it right, and which ones are the ones where you can cut some corners, or maybe sometimes even do it based on past habits or simple heuristics, managerial judgment or whatever. So this is basically a call towards the end of the book to saying, don't be overwhelmed by this. We don't expect a company to go through all these steps for every single decision. It's not realistic, not desirable. What you want to do is to, save that kind of thinking, that kind of process for the decisions that really matter.
Yeah, so you really need to evaluate the importance of the decision you were making and the costs you have. So I think that's the first step. And well, we always have to talk about AI because AI is all around, and with AI evolving so rapidly right now, what role will human judgment play in decision make? Do you think you're gonna have AI for decisions all the time? Is what you have this in the last chapter of the
Yeah,
book.
so AI is going to be an incredible help in improving the quality of decision making, because those agents are acquiring a degree of autonomy and capability that will enable them to make a lot of decisions very quickly, fast, and perhaps even better than human experts can in some situations. But I think it is important to realize that human expertise is very valuable, and that we need to try to, for a lot of organizations, competitive advantage really lies in that. So one issue that I see sometimes with advanced analytics and now with AI is that people tend to think, oh, now the smart people with the data are there, they can take care of it. Or, now AI can do all of this. And people stop thinking. It's almost like give them a license to disengage almost from the decision-making process. And I think that's a bad mistake. In fact, I would argue that with more complex data, more complex models, more complex economy, we need to think harder, not less. And so I think with AI, it's not like AI is going to remove the need for us to think very hard. I think it's only going to make that thinking even harder. So in a way, I think, but the promise is that it will be a great multiplier. If you have talent, if you have values, if you have expertise, AI will enable you to do much more with it. And so I think in that sense, it's an incredible gift where we might be able to speed up innovation, we might be able to improve customer experience, improve the quality of our processes, improve efficiencies and productivity. All of these things are good, and we can do them with AI. But that doesn't mean that the humans are obsolete. Doesn't mean that the human expertise, human creativity, human passion and leadership are not going to be important in the future. They're going to be as important as ever, maybe even more important.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you. You know, there's no replacement for human intelligence and human judgment most of the time. And what are your advice for a leader who would like to shift from data-driven decisions to decision-driven analytics?
My first advice would be read the book. I think that would be.
And they have a chance to win a copy of the book, you know.
And then would be to try to think carefully about the processes by which you make decisions and your team makes the decisions. Try to see how some of the distinctions that we discussed in this webinar today, like factual versus counterfactual, fuzzy versus, fuzzy questions and answers, all those things, how you might be able to take some of that on board and improve the quality of decisions. I think, for example, that if a company can improve the way that decision makers and analysts interact, for example, by training decision makers in asking precise questions, by helping analysts provide the data that are really instrumental to important decisions, then I think you might be able to already make a big difference in improving the quality of decisions, reducing conflict, increasing coordination, and hopefully learning. It takes a degree of intellectual humility. Managers need to acknowledge that certain things they don't know or they were doing wrong. Analysts need to acknowledge that they also, a lot of things they don't understand. They're not domain experts. They don't really know the business context. So oftentimes a lot of problems might arise from the fact that analyst is given a vague brief. And the analyst is a technical expert. He's not a domain expert. They don't know anything about maybe how a sales process works in the field. And so they might not be able to actually identify what the best courses of action or interpret the data correctly. And so I think you need that interface, a collaboration.
Yeah, well, it was really a pleasure, talking to you. And you and Bart just conclude the book by stating, data is just a means to an end. What matters is decisions we make. What are your final thoughts on this?
Yeah, that I think we should never put data on a pedestal, like glorified data. I mean, data are just a tool that we use to make better decisions. And it's a cool tool, and it's a shiny tool, and it's exciting with a lot of technology, smart people. It's great. But it's just a means to an end. In the end, what matters is not the data, is what we do with it.
Yeah, I think that it really needs to be clear, because sometimes you just forget. You have piles of data, you just try to use that, and you don't know if it really matters or not to the decisions or to business outcome. So I think you always need to remind about that. Well, Stefano, thank you so much. And, it was a pleasure talking to you. And I read the book, and I also, talk to the guys here in the audience to read the book also, because it's great and very easy to read, very fun, a lot of examples, very practical.
Thank you very much for having me. I hope it was a useful discussion for your participants and for you all. I was really happy to get the invitation and have the opportunity to talk about the book. And if I'm very active on LinkedIn on AI analytics and marketing topics mostly. So that's one way of keep in touch and seeing latest advice. But both the research I produce, but also our institute AI at Wharton. We have a lot of researchers doing interesting work on analytics and AI.
Yeah, and I always just go to the Wharton website to check what you are doing there, and there are a lot of great stuff, about the analytics and AI and marketing and things like that.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.